Ukraine lays down demands for allowing Russian ammonia transit, Reuters. Kiev wants the grain deal to be expanded to include more ports and commodities. Ukraine will let Russian ammonia pass through its territory only if the renewed Black Sea grain deal allows the country to ship other commodities from more ports, Reuters reported on Friday, citing government sources. This is the first response by Kiev to Moscow's demand to include ammonia shipments under the agreement. In April, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow wanted a pipeline that delivered Russian ammonia to a Ukrainian Black Sea port to be restarted, and the financial operations of Russian fertilizer companies to be unblocked. The most recent deal includes 3 of Ukraine's major Black Sea ports, although Kiev has repeatedly demanded that the deal should cover more goods and ports. The government source, however, provided no details about the additional commodities Ukraine wanted included. According to the source, the current version of the agreement made no mention of the ammonia pipeline and transit, and a further deal would be needed to cover it. On Thursday, Russian officials said that the new agreement had been reached after what it called a qualified result in negotiations over easing restrictions on Russian agricultural exports. The Black Sea grain deal between Russia and Ukraine was clinched through the mediation of the UN and Turkey last July. It allowed Ukraine to ship around 30 million metric tons of corn, wheat, soy and other grain. As part of the agreement, the UN was supposed to facilitate the unblocking of Russian grain and fertilizer exports. According to Moscow, the latter never happened. Third China-CEEC Expo, China. CEECs gear up for closer economic, trade relations. Since the founding of the China Central and Eastern European countries, CEECs, cooperation mechanism in 2012, China and CEECs have yielded fruitful achievements. 2023 marks the beginning of the second decade of China-CEEC cooperation, and the two sides hope for closer economic and trade ties. As a platform mirroring the two sides' trade ties, the third China-CEEC Expo and International Consumer Goods Fair, which is simply called the ChinaCEEC Expo, has attracted over 400 exhibitors from CEECs and other European countries. Purchase orders worth over 10 billion yuan, about $1.43 billion, for CEEC products are expected during the 5-day event, which will conclude on Saturday in the eastern Chinese city of Ningbo. At the Expo's first signing ceremony for business deals on Tuesday, 10 import deals and 5 cooperation programs with a total value of 2.18 billion yuan were inked. The contracts cover a wide range of agri-products, such as meat and dairy, and other consumer goods, such as sports utilities and health products. Of the deals, Ningbo Lianbang Changjiun International Trading Co., Ltd. placed an order worth 100 million yuan for beef from a Hungarian company. My company will also purchase Polish milk, Hungarian wines, and other CEEC products to enrich Chinese consumers' tables, said Sun Chonglong, executive director of the Chinese company. As the guest country of honor, Hungary has 35 companies participating in the Expo. With an increasing number of Hungarian enterprises recognizing the immense opportunities available in China. Their participation in the Expo demonstrates a solid commitment to fostering economic and trade ties between the two countries, said Janet Ihaz, manager of Chinese relations at the Hungarian Export Promotion Agency. With the country pavilion and the dedicated business delegation, the agency is committed to establishing and reinforcing alliances with Chinese firms, exploring untapped business prospects, and advancing the export of Hungarian goods and services, Ihaz said. The China-CEEC cooperation has been deepening over the years. Polish milk and cookies have gradually entered the daily life of Chinese consumers through the Expo, said Andrzej Jikniewicz, chief representative of the Polish Investment and Trade Agency in China. We hope to bring more quality products to China and expand the market share in gaming, science and technology, and medicine. Data showed that since 2012, China's trade with CEECs has grown at an average annual rate of 8.1%, and China's imports from CEECs have increased at an average rate of 9.2% annually. In the first quarter of this year, two-way trade totaled $33.3 billion, up 1.6% year-on-year. The Expo also offers a broad platform for China-CEEC investment projects. TCL has cooperated with CEECs for many years, said Li Dongsheng, chairman of the Chinese consumer electronics giant TCL. Li said TCL has invested in a factory and an EU R&D center in Poland, and it produces more than 3 million TVs a year. The launch of the China-Europe freight trains has greatly improved the efficiency of the supply chain and enhanced the competitiveness of our products in the European market. We are planning to build a second factory in CEECs, Li said. So far, the two-way investment between China and CEECs has reached nearly $20 billion. In the first quarter of this year, China's direct investment in CEECs increased by 148% year-on-year, covering various fields like auto parts, home appliances, medicine, logistics, energy, and minerals. Zhejiang Huashuo Technology Co., Limited, a Chinese high-tech enterprise integrating R&D and manufacturing of new energy vehicles core components, has offices in Europe. Zhang Taixin, general manager of the company's Hungarian branch, said it began constructing a factory in Hungary's Debrecen in April last year. The first phase was completed in February this year and has started trial operations. Hungary welcomes investment from Asia. We are confident in the European market, said Zhang. Bosnia and Herzegovina has broad prospects for cooperation with China and other CEECs in energy, infrastructure, green economic transformation, and clean energy. We envision more cooperation projects in the future, said Zdravko Marinkovic, president of the Foreign Trade Chamber of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In an exclusive interview with CGTN, former Romanian Prime Minister Viorica Dancila talked about her first visit to Ningbo and expressed her appreciation to the Third China-CEEC Expo, noting that organizers nearly moved Central and Eastern Europe to Ningbo. Besides for economic cooperation, she also hoped that more young Chinese people can visit Romania and Romanian youths can come to China, saying that this kind of exchange is very important. We need to connect the friendship between the two countries and maintain this tradition. UK and geriatric decline, financier. Guy Hans says Britain will soon be poorer than Poland. Brexit has weakened the UK economy and driven the nation into a sort of geriatric decline, British financier and chairman of the private equity firm Terra Firma told Bloomberg on Friday. Since the UK left the European Union, it has been competing on the world stage, but the country's current laws are not suitable for the new environment, billionaire Guy Hans suggested in the outlet's Weekly in the City podcast. Unless change happens, the UK risks becoming poorer compared to other European countries. I look at the UK and see that, in 2030, Poland will be wealthier than we are, he said. In 2040, we will be the poor man in Europe. According to Hans, the UK should not have left the EU, as the country needs rule of law and consistency, but not a single politician is talking about going back. He lamented that Brexit has essentially thrown the country back 50 years, to the 1970s, a decade that is widely remembered as a time of crisis, with skyrocketing inflation, high unemployment, strikes, and power cuts. The enormous amount of political change that has happened in the UK over the past 7 years has left investors concerned, and the public lacking confidence, the billionaire believes. Now that the UK is out of the EU, the British government could take a radical approach and change some of its laws, Hans said, citing the country's extraordinarily complex labour laws that are a nightmare compared to other European countries. The UK also needs some boring bookkeeping, and the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak seems to be good at it, according to Hans. The financier noted that the British government has succeeded in repairing some of the damage caused by Liz Truss, whose economic policies were absolutely disastrous and would have led to the country needing a bailout. Truss's argument, however, that the UK needed to become much more productive to be more competitive was 100% right. Think tank rebukes groundless China economic gloom rhetoric. There is no basis for the peak China rhetoric, concluded a Chinese think tank report released Friday. The China collapse theory is similarly unsound. The peak China theory refers to a belief that China has reached its peak in terms of economic growth and global influence. Therefore, the country is due to experience a decline in the future. The Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University argued in the report that the research method employed by peak China theorists has major flaws, including gaps in rationale and weak research backing strong conclusions. The peak China theory asserts that a slowdown in China's economic growth means it has reached its peak. However, the institute argued that it is a natural circumstance that follows the evolution of economic development. Based on economic logic, the slowdown expresses neither an absolute nor relative peak. The report also countered the thesis that China's economic growth will be suppressed by U.S. export restrictions on technology, arguing that China has made major advances in basic research and cutting-edge technologies despite U.S. suppression. The consequence of sci-tech suppression will inevitably hurt both sides, leading to insufferable calamities to China and the U.S., the report contended, adding that a complete technology decoupling between the two countries is unlikely. Chongyang analysts predict that China's economic rise will continue and surpass the U.S. in size by 2030. Driven by the four engines of technological advancement, structural upgrade, urban development, and further reform and opening up, China's economy will embark on a medium to high growth rate which is faster than the global average and the U.S. economy. UK to invest up to $1.2 billion in semiconductor industry over 20 years. The United Kingdom pledged up to £1 billion, $1.2 billion, in funding on Friday for national chipmakers, to be rolled out over the next 2 decades in a bid to secure a place in the growing semiconductor market. The National Semiconductor Strategy sets out how up to £1 billion of government investment will boost the UK's strengths and skills in design, R&D, and compound semiconductors, while helping to grow domestic chip firms across the UK, the statement read. Financial support will be delivered in installments of £200 million over the years 2023 to 2025, followed by £1 billion in the next decade. This money will make it easier for British firms to access prototyping, tools, and business support. The global market of semiconductors, used in virtually every piece of modern technology, is expected to grow to $1 trillion by 2030. 1 trillion semiconductors are produced globally every year, with China's Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan making up the top 3 producers. U.S. recession fears loom large over G7 summit. U.S. President Joe Biden arrived in Japan on Thursday for the annual G7 summit. He intends to cut his trip to Asia short and return to the U.S. on Sunday, since he has to continue negotiations with congressional leaders on raising the country's debt ceiling. Debates over the debt ceiling have intensified over the past few weeks, putting the U.S. government under pressure to meet the deadline at the end of the month. In a letter to congressional leaders this Monday, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned that the country could face a default on its debt obligations as early as June 1 if Congress fails to raise the borrowing cap. If that happens, the Department of the Treasury will likely be unable to fulfill all of the government's obligations. Since 2001, the U.S. federal government's budget has run a deficit of nearly $1 trillion every year, according to the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, a part of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. However, starting from 2016, the growth in spending on Social Security, healthcare, and interest on the federal debt has exceeded the growth of federal revenue, resulting in a situation where the country spends significantly more money than it receives from taxes and other sources of income. To cover the shortfall, the government needs to borrow in order to sustain the payments that Congress has already approved. A debt ceiling standoff. The U.S. government hit its $31.4 trillion borrowing limit in January 2023, amid a standoff between Republicans and Democrats on lifting the ceiling. Failure to meet the government's obligations would cause irreparable harm to the U.S. economy, the livelihoods of all Americans, and global financial stability, Treasury Secretary and former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen wrote to Congress in January 2023. Indeed, in the past, even threats the U.S. government might fail to meet its obligations have caused real harm, including the only credit rating downgrade in the history of our nation in 2011. Now, with the U.S. running up against the debt ceiling deadline, and negotiations between Congress and the White House remaining deadlocked, the issue of the debt ceiling has once again become a contentious topic. If the two sides can't strike a deal to raise the country's debt ceiling, millions of Americans will feel the impact. The White House states that throughout history, approaching the U.S. debt ceiling has proven to cause big disruptions in financial markets, adversely affecting households and businesses. The threat of a U.S. default has always made Congress ultimately agree on a deal to raise the debt limit, according to Roger W. Ferguson Jr., an expert in the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, an independent and nonpartisan membership think tank based in New York. A prolonged banking turmoil. As the U.S. is grappling with a national debt dilemma, another crisis is putting American confidence in their financial well-being to the test, the bank collapse. In early May, U.S. regulators seized First Republic Bank and sold its assets to J.P. Morgan Chase, in a deal to resolve the largest bank failure in the U.S. since the 2008 financial crisis. The move is to put an end to a prolonged banking turmoil that began with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in March. The collapse of these banks has disrupted the stability of the financial system, as these institutions play a crucial role in facilitating lending, investment and liquidity in the economy. Meanwhile, job losses in the banking sector have a spillover effect on other industries that rely on banking services, such as real estate and construction. It creates a loss of confidence among investors and consumers, leading to a decrease in lending and investment activities. This contraction in credit availability hampers economic growth and can potentially trigger a recession. U.S. authorities needed to stay vigilant on new vulnerabilities in the U.S. banking sector, including in regional banks, that could emerge in the adjustment to a much higher interest rate environment, International Monetary Fund spokesperson Julie Kozak said during a news briefing. Uncertain economic outlook. Amid an ongoing banking system crisis, businesses have scaled back investments due to increased borrowing costs. The economy of the nation experienced a slowdown during the first quarter of this year, and the country is now on the verge of a potential debt default in just 2 weeks. A U.S. debt default prompted by failure to raise the country's debt ceiling would have very serious repercussions for the U.S. economy as well as the global economy, including likely higher borrowing costs, Kozak said. Although it is unable to fully gauge the damage a possible default would create, economists warn that it could have disastrous economic consequences, especially the volatility across equity, debt, and other markets. If a default occurs, the financial sector will bear the brunt first, then the service sector, said Chu Qiang, a research fellow at Beijing Foreign Studies University. As the whole international market is fragile, a real default would have a major impact on the global gross domestic product and employment, Chu told CGTN. Economic threats won't get out of hand, but could still hurt global recovery prospects, he added. EU countries' inflation shows no sign of slowing. Consumer prices in Austria saw their highest annual increase last year since 1975. Austria's consumer price inflation has continued to rise, accelerating to 9.7% in April on an annual basis, the National Statistics Office reported on Wednesday. According to Statistics Austria, the figure jumped from 9.2% in the previous month and was just below the 9.8% increase seen in a flash report published on May 2. Inflation harmonized to compare with other European Union countries also increased in April to 9.5%, up from 9.2% in March. The report indicated that utility bills saw a major spike of 14.7% year-on-year, followed by a 14.2% rise in restaurant and hotel costs. Transport charges were 3.3% higher compared to April 2022. The prices for package tours abroad, which are in high demand, have increased significantly compared to the previous year and are becoming an important driver of inflation for the first time in a long time, the head of the Statistics Office, Tobias Thomas, stated. Prices for package tours with flights soared by 18.5% compared to April last year, according to the agency. Airline tickets were up 19.1% year-on-year. The Austrian government has faced growing criticism over its efforts to tackle inflation, which is above the EU average. Authorities have so far mainly relied on measures such as support payments, and have only directly intervened with an electricity price cap,